First of all, welcome to everyone who's here in the room and to all of those following on the webinar. I'm going to follow Len's comments with a focus, again, to kind of recapitulate what's going on in the Middle East, a focus on the movement of large numbers of people into Europe, but really try to spend the bulk of my time looking for solutions. I think this is about doing good, not simply wringing our hands at the horrible things that are happening to populations in the Middle East in their flight away from danger. So I'm going to talk first again about the deteriorating conditions in the Middle Eastern camps, particularly the countries of first-line refuge, Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. Talk about the population movements of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants into Europe and the response, I would say the very incoherent and often quite inhumane response. And then, again, fundamentally focus on models and ideas for a global solution. My main point is we've been here before, we've done this work, we know how to respond as a global community, and the time is right now, long past time, for action. So the war continues, it's escalating. Russia's now jumping in, ostensibly to fight ISIS, but likely to be supporting the Assad regime. There is no real end in sight, politically or militarily, to end this conflict. The UN refugee appeal is now meeting only about 37% of commitments. $4.5 billion is needed. We have less than half of that. World Food Program has cut its monthly food vouchers in half. Tensions are rising along the borders. Countries are talking about or even acting to close the borders, as hard as that may seem to do. And there's resistance among the host communities and governments to providing continued services. And again, just to reiterate these numbers, 12.2 million affected by conflict in Syria, 7.6 million internally displaced, more than 4 million refugees in the region, of whom, as I'll speak to in a minute, nearly 500,000 have fled the region, moving into Europe, looking for temporary sanctuary and more permanent asylum. And a quote that just jumped out at me from a recent Washington Post article from a Syrian refugee in Lebanon: "This is not a life. We are only alive because we are not dead." So Europe. The Arab Spring in 2011 led to an increase in undocumented migration and asylum claims in Europe. The fall of the Gaddafi regime, ongoing civil war, created a chaotic vacuum in Libya that was exploited by smugglers and traffickers looking to make a profit off the movement of vulnerable populations, and people began to move. Who wouldn't? If you can't live in your own country due to ongoing war and conflict, you can't live in a neighboring country because of really inhospitable and unsustainable conditions. You will move. That's the human instinct, is to survive. And people have been moving. So nearly 500,000 refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers have poured into Europe, mostly by sea, but now many moving through an overland route through the Balkan countries. The largest numbers that Europe has seen since 1945, but again, not nearly as much as countries like Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, and others have been hosting for many years. Syrians make up a little bit over half of this influx, followed by Afghans, Eritreans, and other populations. So these are the numbers from the International Organization for Migration. Again, you can see 473,000 arrivals. These are the undocumented, at least the ones that are counted. 2,800 people known to have died, or at least reported as missing, in making this very hazardous journey in unseaworthy vessels across the Mediterranean. And we don't know how many deaths have occurred as people have taken land routes. But here you can see some of that movement overland as people move out of Syria through Turkey and are attempting to traverse each one of these very hazardous border crossings from Turkey into countries further in the kind of European interior, some moving on into Greece, some moving through the Balkan states, and attempting to get into Hungary, which I will show you later is one of the sort of frontline states in what's called the Schengen zone, where it's a visa-free movement of population. So if you get in there, the notion is you are free to move inside that region and be somewhat safer from arrest, detention, deportation. Remains to be seen exactly how that will play out. And I'll get into some of the ways in which Europe has not responded very hospitably. Some have and some have not. But again, models for these kinds of global crises exist. In the 1970s and 1980s, I had the privilege to work with many in the international community, United Nations, non-governmental organizations, and international and national governments to respond to this massive exodus of people from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, the so-called Indo-Chinese Refugee Crisis. There were two conferences. The first one in '79 came together and pledged funding, massive funding for camps in so-called first asylum countries, stabilize refuge, stabilize protection for the populations who are fleeing, persuade the governments in these frontline states not to push boat people back, not to erect fences and shoot at those who cross the border, but allow them to come in. Backing that commitment up was commitments from resettlement countries, mostly in the West, but some around the world, US, Canada, Australia, France, and so forth, committing hundreds of thousands of resettlement spots to support resettlement for people so they wouldn't remain for years on end in these camps of first asylum. Later, what was added in was an additional screening mechanism to allow for a distinction between refugees and non-refugees to be made, with ultimately safe repatriation of those who are deemed to be non-refugees. So these are the elements we need and more to put in place to provide an adequate global response to this global crisis now facing us. I won't get into the first question, which is political solution. As Len said, we're not political scientists. We're certainly not military strategists, but certainly the root cause of this is the ongoing conflict in Syria, and a political solution is needed desperately. I won't get into that. I will not also focus on the need for increased aid for internally displaced persons, IDPs, and conflict affected in Syria. Time would not permit me to get into all of these different aspects, but I do want to focus on the last three. Increased relief and development aid for refugees and migrants in the Middle East. I would also add Africa, although my focus is on the Middle East here. There are many populations fleeing from African countries through the Middle East and on into Europe. A coordinated and humane treatment for all arrivals in Europe with coherent asylum policies and local settlement for those who meet refugee status determinations. Safe return or onward migration for non-refugees. If you don't meet refugee criteria, it doesn't mean you get immediately deported. There are safe migration policies, programs, and treaty instruments in place which European countries are signatory to that must be honored. And also increased international resettlement commitments, including by the United States, but I'll point out some other countries that really need to step up and do the job more as well. So first of all, relief and development aid. International donors need to pledge 100% of funding for the current appeal, the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan. $4.5 billion is needed. Of the top donor countries, only Kuwait among Gulf states is in the top 10 of donors. There's a great deal of wealth in the Gulf states. Where's the money? The Resilience Plan, which focuses more on empowerment of people through rapid employment, life skills training, i.e. not the humanitarian aid, which is basic food, water, shelter, emergency aid. That resilience plan is only 16% funded, and only about 270,000 adults out of more than 2 million adults, half of this population who are in flight and refuge in the Middle East are children. But among those who are adults and could and should work, only about 270,000 spots, of which only less than a quarter are funded, are available for wage employment. People need to work. Everyone wants to work. Refugees, along with all other populations who are moving, do want to work, and they're being denied that opportunity. So the development approach needs to really take on a region-wide commitment, and I would include again the Gulf states who need workers but are not prepared to offer anything more than very temporary guest worker allocations, need to step up and commit to employment, education, capacity building for service delivery systems, not just in the health sector, but education, social services, and the like, and policy support to back these commitments up. So that's the first step, relief and development aid in the Middle East. Europe, stop building fences, stop shooting water cannons, stop tear gassing populations, open your doors, and provide for inclusive policies and practices that basically say, we will grant you temporary right to remain with life with dignity, core support for basic services, and an opportunity to present your case, not at a fence with a gun pointed at you, but in a reception center that provides you an adequate place to present a claim for asylum or a claim for some onward migrant options. Reform the Dublin regulation, which is a way of Europe regulated its approach by saying the first country you enter in the EU Schengen zone is the place that you have to stay and be processed. So it's putting more pressures on countries like Hungary and others in the front line to say, we won't let them in at all if we have to take the ultimate responsibility. So share that load out. Revise these policies so that asylum seekers can be moved around and the responsibility shared across all of the countries that are responsible for providing temporary refuge and processing. Establish reception and transit centers. We hear so much talk about detention centers, which are camps with fences built around them. Too many populations around the world are living in protracted refugee situations. The average time spent in a refugee camp among more than 10 million people in the world is 17 years. That's not where Syrians and others are seeking to go. So they need to get into a reception and transit center where they're free to move in and out, but where they can be processed for either asylum, refugee status determination, or ongoing either safe return or onward migration if considered to be a non-refugee. So harmonize asylum policies. This is just a graph from the BBC showing some of the places where these border fences are being erected. I won't get into all of the notional details about what's a Schengen country, what's EU, but non-Schengen, non-EU, non-Schengen. Imagine you're a Syrian refugee fleeing for your life and you're trying to sort this out, which is the best country to go to, along with all of the other things you need to think about for yourself and your family. It's very complicated. This is not the time to be parsing these kinds of policies, but to really open the doors and allow people to stay temporarily until they can sort out longer-term, more durable future options. Increased international resettlement. Germany has pledged to take up to 1 million asylum seekers. It's not clear if that's a commitment for 1 million to stay, but certainly are opening to the possibility of processing up to 1 million, and the EU countries are considering, I don't think they've finalized an agreement, on sharing out quotas for about 160,000 other asylum seekers. That's people fleeing and seeking asylum in Europe. There are also Syrian refugees in the Middle East who deserve and need permanent resettlement. Britain has committed to take 20,000 over 5 years, only from the camps, not from Europe. France and Germany have committed to resettlement additional numbers from the camps, not including the asylum seekers in Europe. Canada said it will speed up processing but won't increase numbers. The U.S. has pledged to take 10,000, and we may be hearing we're certainly hearing calls for more. We may be hearing some commitments for further numbers, but certainly the U.S. can and should do more and has done more in the past. Gulf states, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, the commitment of Syrian resettlement of refugees, 0. That needs to change. So I will end, hopefully not on a sad note or an unhappy note, but a hopeful note. I think we can do good. The world has come together before to take on these kinds of global crises. Everyone needs to step up in its commitments of resources, of resettlement, of safe refuge and asylum, but fundamentally to protect the lives of those who are endangered by the conflict inside Syria, all of those who have fled, both to the Middle East and beyond, and do more to save lives, as we say in this school, millions at a time. Thank you.
Court, you said you don't do geopolitics, but it sounded like geopolitics to me. So they were both incredibly moving and startling talks, and I think what stuck with me was that you said that of 10 million refugees around the world, the average stay in a camp is 17 years. That's a lifetime, right? That's a thing about children who are being born in those camps. So before Ann gets here, I just want to take some Q&A. There's a lot of food for thought in what you said, and maybe I'll ask you fellows to just come up and take a mic, and then people who have questions. And Bob, I see you getting up. Would you come to the microphone and direct your questions to the court or to Len? Thank you.